Welcome to the debut episode of the Convention on Cluster Munitions Meet the Makers podcast series, where we speak with key stakeholders that helped bring the convention to life and who contribute to its effective work today, protecting communities from cluster munition harm. Today, 30 May is the anniversary of the adoption of the Convention on Cluster Munitions in Dublin, Ireland in 2008. On this special occasion, it's a pleasure to welcome as our first podcast guest Fahad Ahmed from the Legal Division of the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva to talk about the convention, its roots in international humanitarian law, and why ensuring states abide by the prohibition on the weapon is more important than ever.
Thank you very much, Jared, and thank you for the invitation, for inviting me and the International Committee of the Red Cross to participate in this very important initiative of the Cluster Munitions Convention. As you introduced me, I'm here working at the ICRC headquarters where we're recording this podcast, and I am based with the legal division of the ICRC, specifically with the division that works towards supporting states in implementing their international humanitarian law obligations. My specific focus is on weapons-related treaties that deal with either conventional or weapons of mass destruction. And in that framework, I work closely with the implementation support units, with states, with all stakeholders on developing tools, developing mechanisms to help in the implementation of these very, very important disarmament, however, with the IHL focus treaties.
Thank you so much for that thorough introduction. Let's jump right in and talk about what is the interest of the International Committee of the Red Cross vis-a-vis the Convention on Cluster Munitions and these other disarmament treaties that you've just referred to.
So Jared, first of all, I think it's a very important year for the International Committee of the Red Cross because it is the 75th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions, as you very well know, were established to ensure that international humanitarian law governs the way conduct of hostilities or fighting takes place between parties to an armed conflict. These parties need to ensure, according to their obligations under the Geneva Conventions, that this fighting is fair, that it's done within the principles of proportionality, distinction, etc. This ensures that in this fighting, civilians and people who are hors de combat are spared. Similarly, the conventions that we are here to discuss today, the Cluster Munition Convention, also ensures that the means and methods of warfare are limited. And therefore, we are not using weapons that are so perverse in their nature that they cannot be used, A, in a discriminate fashion, and B, that the after effects of these weapons far outlast any military necessity that a commander may have when waging a conflict or waging a war. And therefore, the ICRC, in order to ensure that the war is more humane, works towards promoting all of these weapons-related treaties, but specifically Cluster Munitions Convention. Now, before we go into the nitty-gritties of it, we should understand what a cluster munition is. And I think that's where we start. So a cluster munition is a weapon that disperses or releases explosive submunitions, which are small bomblets. They are unguided, they weigh less than 20 kilograms, and they are designed to explode either prior to or in impact. Now, these explosives can be from 12 to 600. They can be deployed by an aircraft, by a mortar, by rockets or missiles. So they spread over a wide range. The problem that one faces with these bomblets is that a lot of these bomblets remain unexploded. So even if at that time when the weapon is deployed, the purpose is of military nature, the bomblets that do not explode end up exploding 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and in some cases even 50 to 60 years after the fighting has stopped. Laos, which is a party to the convention, is still clearing cluster munitions on their territory, which exists from the 1960s. So you can imagine the humanitarian consequence of these munitions on the civilian population.
Wow, thank you again that you mentioned the indiscriminate nature of these weapons and at the core of this discussion. The Convention on Cluster Munitions is, some would say, a relatively overlooked convention in terms of public perception and understanding those dynamics that you just so well and clearly explained. What's the relevance of this convention historically and in the current global context where we're seeing a large number of armed conflicts?
So, first of all, I don't think it can be denied in any shape or form that cluster munition is indeed one of the world's most treacherous weapons. And therefore, any usage of cluster munitions by anyone under any circumstances is absolutely unacceptable in the given context that we are and the weapons that we have at our disposal. You can see that the impact of cluster munitions, and I'm referring to a recent report that came out of the Cluster Munitions Coalition. 95% of the casualties of the usage of cluster munitions are civilians, which means that the military advantage was only 5%, while 95% of it were either incidental damage or what is also sometimes referred to as collateral damage. All the casualties that were recorded, at least in 2020 to 2021, were from clusters that were deployed in earlier conflicts. So they were because of the remnants of cluster munitions and not because of the usage. That, of course, changed in 2022, where we saw some fresh usage of cluster munitions. The convention, which has seen remarkable success since its entry into force, I think, is that none of the states parties to the convention have used cluster munitions since they've signed the convention. So I think that's an extremely positive step that has come out of the convention. And none of them have. All the parties to the convention have never used since signing the convention, and therefore it is really important that we get more parties and more states into the fold of the convention, because you can see that it has a norm creative value, that there is a deterrence value of this convention. The second thing is that this convention disproportionately affects civilians. And no modern military in this day and age would want to target civilians specifically. However, it is absolutely impossible when it comes to this convention, be it looking at the principle of discrimination or be it looking at the principle of proportionality. Also, the responsibility to clear and make sure that the land is now available for civilians to be able to come back is massive, and therefore requires a lot of energy, a lot of resources, and a lot of political will. I don't think that any global economy today is ready to deal with this issue in the current situation. From the ICRC's perspective, first of all, we would hope that there is peace in this world. But however, if there is any resort to armed violence, that resort to armed violence should be within certain principles. Clearly, from our reading of the bomblets of cluster munitions, this does not fall within the legitimate usage. And therefore, the ICRC, which is usually very, very careful in terms of looking at weapons, came out in support of this convention when it was being drafted, when it was being discussed, to say that we don't see how this can be used discriminately. When there is a failure of about 40% of these bomblets, we don't see how this can meet any military necessity either. Now we are aware that there are arguments from certain states that the rate of explosion now is close to 95%, and therefore there is only 5% of bomblets that remain unexploded, or that there are mechanisms that are built into these munitions which allow them to self-detonate after a certain amount of time. However, most of these claims have been made under controlled test conditions. Anywhere that we've seen this weapon being deployed in the battlefield, you see that this percentage increases drastically, simply because there are many other factors that are beyond the control of the parties to the armed conflict, be it the speed of the wind, be it the terrain, etc., etc. It is more exacerbated these days is because the battlefield has changed. Earlier, the battlefield was more rural, it was more within jungles, within deserts. Now you see the battlefield has moved to an urban setting. And this problem now gets exacerbated because people are not able to access water resources, people are not able to go back to their fields, people are not able to go back to water filtration plants, and economy is not able to come back to stabilize. And therefore we think that given the modern warfare, this weapon and the usage of this weapon should be completely banned, and therefore all states should join the wagon of not using these weapons.
Thank you. I thought it was very interesting too, your comment on beyond the human cost, the economic cost of futures generations cleaning up this weapon, as you pointed out, for 50, 60 years is incredible. With that in mind, I mean, you mentioned earlier you've worked in a number of different settings around the world. Can you share some of your experience, personal experience, in terms of the impact of the convention and of the weapon on the communities that you've worked in and worked with?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, Jared, for this question. And one of the reasons that this convention is very, very personal to me is because of the experiences that I've had in the field and the impact that I've seen on civilian population, especially on children. One of the stories that I remember very, very vividly is the story from the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, where there was a little girl, 11-year-old girl called Sosa, and she was coming back from school walking under a bridge. While walking under the bridge, she noticed a shiny object, and she picked it up. To her mind, it was a metallic ball which was very shiny and looked very beautiful. Her brother's birthday was coming up, so she thought, given that she lived life in abject poverty, that she would give this ball as a gift to her brother. So she took the object and she brought it back home. While she was wrapping this ball up as a gift for her younger brother, she accidentally dropped it, and the object was actually a bomblet which had not exploded. There was an explosion inside her house, and baby Sosa lost one of her arms and had severe injuries to her eyes. The ICRC medical team was able to help her, but unfortunately we could not save the arm. And therefore today she lives her life with an assisted device that the ICRC was able to provide. But clearly some of these can be prevented. And this is where we think, after having seen the impact of a child who had nothing to do with the conflict, who took no part in hostilities, was minding her own business, was not even close to the theater of conflict, was affected. And therefore, if we want to make sure that our future generations are saved and are prevented from being affected by this, we need to ensure that this weapon that keeps on killing needs to now stop. There are many stories this story was from the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, but I could equally come up from a story from Lebanon or from Yemen, where many, many children, women, men who go to tend their fields, people with disabilities are all disproportionately affected because they do not have the possibilities to avoid these areas and must return to them for their food, for their sustenance. And this has clearly affected me in a very, very deep way. The way the ICRC addresses this is manifold. Obviously, we are Some of the work that the ICRC does is in Geneva and in New York, where a lot of policy is being discussed. At the same time, we, with our delegations in the field, are able to provide many different kinds of support. So when populations are affected, as was the case of baby Sosa, we are able to provide assisted devices. At the same time, our colleagues are also able to provide mine risk awareness and cluster awareness exercises with communities so that they avoid going to these areas and behave in a safe manner. On another level, we have colleagues who are former bomb disposal experts. They are able to also help authorities, be they state or non-state authorities, to clear certain areas, to provide them technical support so that they are able to clear certain areas, or to support them to meet their requirements through international cooperation agreements. So we try to provide a multifaceted support, but what I must say very humbly is that the needs are too many. And even if all of us, all organizations of the world come together, we wouldn't be able to provide the support that these communities need. And therefore, the better way is to prevent this from happening in the first place.
This exactly is, wouldn't it be nice if we could prevent this tragedy rather than going around trying to clean this up for years after the fact, not to mention these horrible human tragedies that you've just described. Indeed. And we're back with Fahad Ahmed from the ICRC headquarters in Geneva, talking about cluster munitions and the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Fahad, you've just described some of the horrible consequences of cluster munition use on communities around the world. What are the accountability mechanisms available for this convention? Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Well, thanks for that question, Jared. I think first of all, the most important norm that's set by this convention is that from the beginning, any use of cluster munitions anywhere by anyone must be condemned. This has been emphasized by our leadership. This has been emphasized by the leaders of many states parties, and I think this should be our starting point when we're looking towards accountability. Now, coming back to what is generally understood as accountability mechanisms in international relations, for the CCM, there are no specific measures built into the convention. However, there are mechanisms to promote both implementation and to ensure compliance with the convention. For example, in the interest of transparency, you have states parties that are required to report annually to the UN Secretary General on the range of matters, which would include the steps that they've taken to be compliant with the convention. In addition, as you already very well know, there is a meeting of states parties that's held regularly to review the effectiveness of the convention and the progress that states have been made. Should concerns arise about a state's compliance with the convention, a clarification may be sought through the UN Secretary General. So you have built-in mechanisms within the provisions of the convention that a party can seek clarifications with another state that may or may not be using clusters and as a state party to seek clarification. So you have Article 8 of the convention, which provides for various specific mechanisms that are in place. Then what's really very crucial is that each state party that's party to the convention must implement the convention by passing both appropriate legal and administrative measures to implement the convention. One of the most important ones in this is to include the imposition of a penal sanction to both prevent and suppress violations of persons or on territory under the state's jurisdiction or control. And therefore, any use within a state's jurisdiction of cluster munitions is prohibited. And therefore, a state must ensure that they pass domestic legislation to ensure that these weapons are not used domestically on their territories or with people under their jurisdiction. Now, there is support available to states parties to the convention to be able to implement it. The ICRC, among others, has prepared a model law, a legislative checklist to ensure that states are able to implement the convention, that they are able to pass national legislation, and therefore the framework of the convention is strengthened, that there are mechanisms that are available for people to seek recourse, and that individuals can be held accountable domestically for any crimes committed within the purview of the convention. So I think the accountability of the convention plays out in this fashion. Obviously, there's also international cooperation and military cooperation agreements where states ensure that in their military cooperations, other states would not use cluster munitions. And I think that also then strengthens the norm that the use of these weapons should be completely prohibited.
That's really interesting, and the point also about the national legislation. And so this sort of national buy-in, if you will. Of course, they're signing an international convention, but they're adopting it as their own and implementing it. So that's really interesting aspect. Today, Fahad, there are 112 states parties to the Convention on Cluster Munition, which is not an insignificant number. This is a good take-up. Nonetheless, recently, that take-up has been slower. There are some 12 states that have not ratified the treaty, but they have signed it, for example. What are the existing barriers? What does it take to get on board this convention?
I think, Jared, there are many answers to your questions, and one of the main issues that, or one of the main arguments that some states bring forward is that it is still a security need for them to own or possess these weapons. Now, clearly, it is shown that this is not the reality. 112 states have joined the convention. 100 states have not used cluster munitions. That does not mean that these 112 states are in any shape, way, or form security deficient. They are able to still maintain national security. They are still able to maintain security across their borders without using these weapons. So I think the security question was a discussion 20, 30 years ago when we had not really understood the impact of these weapons on the civilian population. I don't think we need to go back to that discussion again. That discussion has been had. We've established that these weapons are treacherous, that these weapons are not fit to be deployed in a heavily civilized population, that any use of these weapons anytime is going to lead to indiscriminate effects, and that the cons completely outweigh the pros, and therefore there is no military argument that one can see which can then tilt the balance in favor of military necessity and not towards humanity. I think humanity most definitely prevails. Now, one of the issues with this convention is the lack of understanding of the convention. I think there is still quite a lot that needs to be done, and it is our joint responsibility to get the message out there about this weapon. This weapon has not been used in all conflicts of the world. However, it has been used in about 20 to 25 states, and I think it can be further restricted. And therefore, it is important that the uptake of states to join the convention, but not only to join the convention and become a party, but even if they have impediments of joining the convention, they should make a resolve to strengthen the norm of the convention, to say that this is a weapon which is completely against the values of humanity and therefore should go the way of the dodo and should never be used again. What we need to see is also we need to speak to states. We need to engage with the states and find out, the ones who've signed the convention, on what are the impediments in joining the convention? Is it a political impediment? Is it an economic impediment? Or do they feel that they don't have the capacity at this point in time to join the convention? And this is where states who are parties to the convention, international organizations such as the UN and the International Committee of the Red Cross, civil society organizations, and the convention itself, the Implementation Support Unit, should offer their services by way of either international cooperation agreements or by bilateral discussions to see how we can help states who are obviously willing to take that extra step to not only become party to this important convention, to join their voice to the voices of 112 states who are saying in unison every single year that they meet that this weapon has got nothing to do in today's world, that this weapon is not a weapon that should be used in civilized society, that this weapon should be completely ostracized from use within modern warfare. And I think these are some of the reasons that I could identify, but there could be more reasons. And I encourage people who are listening to this podcast to come and reach out to us and tell us the reasons that they think are stopping them or states in joining them. And we'd be happy to have a discussion, because it's important that there is dialogue, that there is a discussion, because I have seen no evidence from the work that I've done with the ICRC in the last 10 years that these weapons have any military value. But if states or others are able to provide this, then we're very happy to have a discussion on that. And I think we should encourage dialogue.
Absolutely. No, thank you. As you mentioned, I mean, this is the value of the meeting of states parties every year, but also informal meetings and meetings that ICRC and partners are involved in. And very interesting, your point as well on, in fact, a large number of countries that are not party to the convention that do not use cluster munitions and that support the norm. So, this recognition that these are truly horrible weapons that have no place in a modern armory. Fahad, the UN Secretary General, for one, as well as UNICEF, watch list on children in conflict, for that matter, probably ICRC as well, and others have referred to today's conflicts as a war on children. In the case of cluster munitions and cluster remnants, you pointed out this is literally true, given the casualty rates for cluster munition remnants, which are overwhelmingly civilian and children. Can you talk about the impact of this weapon on children specifically?
So, Jared, I think one thing is very, very clear, that what we've seen in modern warfare, especially in really urbanized centers, that a disproportionate number of civilians are affected by this conflict. Obviously, children are also civilians. They are specifically vulnerable because they need to be protected. They are specifically vulnerable because they do not have understanding of the theaters of the conflict. And they are specifically vulnerable because they have special needs that both parties to the conflict and international organizations need to be aware of. If you look at the statistics, and I was surprised when I was reading the statistics, 71% of the casualties were of children.
Wow.
71%. Let that sink in. 71% of the people who are affected are people who had nothing to do with the conflict, but now will live a life without a limb, now will live a life with impaired vision, now will live a life which will not be completely fulfilling. And I think this is where we have to be very, very careful on when we start justifying the military utility of these weapons, because this is the impact that these weapons have not only on the civilian population of the enemy, but many a times on a state's own civilian population. And I think that's one thing that states need to keep in mind. The second thing is that the states commit to clear areas that are contaminated by these weapons. But given the theater of conflict, it's very hard for them to do it within a short span of time, which means that playing areas, which means that fields, which means that roads to school remain affected for years, years and years to come. And any child, even 15 years after the conflict, could pick up a bomblet and be affected by it. What really comes back to me is the story of this 9-year-old girl in Iraq, in Najaf, who was seriously injured by an exploded munition when returning from a family picnic in her father's car. That particular munition was dropped 30 years ago during the Gulf War. And this is just one of the examples where a conflict that existed many years even before the child was born affected her. So we have to be mindful that these weapons that continue to keep on killing are not only killing people in the past, but they are also killing our future. And the children who are our future get disproportionately affected. Therefore, it's very important for us to preserve our future, to prevent the usage of these weapons, because if we prevent this usage now, we will prevent a child from getting injured 50 years hence. And I think that will be the greatest service that we do to humanity today as individuals.
Wow, that's incredibly eloquent phrasing of this issue, and indeed, it's about protecting our future, and children are our future. So, thank you. Fahad, what do you see, looking at this picture that you've been painting of use of the weapon and its consequences, which is rather bleak? What do you see as the way forward in advancing the Convention on Cluster Munition as a norm and the IHL norm that it embodies?
I think whenever I talk about this convention, I feel a sense of optimism, because I know that on one side you have recent usage of these weapons, but on the other side you have 112 states that have committed to never using it and still continue not to use it. So I'm always optimistic when I look at this treaty, and I want this treaty to succeed. I think what's the most important aspect of it is, the first one is that this convention needs to be universalized. It does not mean that it just needs to be universalized when we have more state parties. I think that is one indicator of the universalization of the convention. The second indicator, and as you mentioned it, is the strengthening of the norm. That the usage of this weapon is stigmatized, that whenever this weapon is used, states come out and say that this was abhorrent and that it should not have been used again. Until and unless there is a stigma attached to the use of this weapon, we will not be able to eradicate it completely. So I think that's very important. Okay. Universalization with more states parties, and universalization in its true sense in the strengthening of the norm that the usage of this weapon is absolutely unacceptable and cannot be used in compliance with international humanitarian law. The second most important thing is the destruction of stockpiles. If you don't have old, obsolete stockpiles, then they will not be sold, transferred, etc. So states who have joined the convention, and even states who believe in a better future, should start destroying their stockpiles to meet their obligations either within the convention or to meet their obligations in the lead up to them joining the convention by already complying with it. And therefore, destruction of stockpiles that exist from the 50s and 60s, I think should be done immediately. The third thing is the clearance. There are a lot of states that have been contaminated from the past. Some of them need support. Some of them need technical expertise. And I think it's very, very important that we provide this expertise to them at this point in time. What's really interesting about this treaty, it's one of the first IHL treaties that I've seen which has an excellent focus on victim assistance. That it was designed from the purview of the victim of a cluster munition. And I think more needs to be done to provide support to mechanisms that are supporting victim assistance. This victim assistance is provided primarily by the states, but obviously organizations such as the ICRC, the UN, and civil society can chip in. But more needs to be done so that we can support people who are affected. And as you know, most of the people affected are civilians, and even amongst civilians, most of them are children. And then finally, international cooperation and assistance. I think that's something that goes without saying, that none of this can be done unless there is political will from all states. And together, there is a feeling that we need to eradicate this weapon because it does not have a space in today's world and time. I think there's a lot that has been done already within the convention, but I think there's need to be more political support for that. There's more financial support that's needed. There's also important support that we need to communicate about this convention, because not so many people are aware about the damage it causes. Many people are aware of landmines, and I think it's very good that we draw parallels with the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention. The major distinctions between the two conventions are that at least when it's clusters, you're able to see the danger. You can see that the clusters are on top of the surface, while the mines are beneath the surface. So perhaps clearance can be done in a slightly easier way, and therefore I don't see why there shouldn't be a focus on clearance of clusters. But it presents a second danger, that because of the nature of these bomblets, that they are shiny, that they look beautiful, they can be confused for a toy. And therefore it's important that we clear them first from urban areas and then slowly from rural areas, so that farmers can go back to tilling their lands, etc., etc. Is that what you wanted to ask, or was there any other point that you wanted me to touch upon?
I think that is really a great global picture, and very much appreciate that you wrapped up talking about these pillars, having the financial support, having the political support, and having the visibility and the education around this, not to mention the immediate need to do education to protect communities. So I think that's exactly the sort of information that really helps people understand the power of this convention and the imperative to get more states on board. In fact, I think you've laid out a clear roadmap from here to the next review conference in 2026. Hopefully there will be states both universalizing in both sense of the word you mentioned, supporting the norm and becoming states parties. And once again, thank you, Fahad Ahmed, from the International Committee of the Red Cross here in Geneva, for taking the time to speak today. This has been a real pleasure and an education. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jared, and thank you for having me.
Thanks again for listening to the debut episode of the Meet the Makers podcast series for the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Once again, this is 30 May, the anniversary of the adoption of the Convention on Cluster Munitions in Dublin, Ireland in 2008.